Well, first of all, I have to say I'm right now in the United States, but even when I travel to Russia, I'm in Moscow. I'm not on the front line, so it's you're a victim of the data that you receive. Ray is one of the guys who has been consistent in saying the best way to learn about a leader, about a nation, is to listen to them over time. And there are patterns that develop the patterns of behavior, how leaders speak to people. Do they lie? When they lie, how do they lie? And I've been applying that to Vladimir Putin. And I'm not going to sit here and say he's perfect, but Vladimir Putin, when he speaks to the Russian people, is honest. That's my experience. He doesn't straight out lie to them. Is he capable of softening a message, or softening a blow, or overemphasizing a point? Sure, all politicians do that, but he doesn't straight out lie to the Russian people. And so when Vladimir Putin, and understand also that when Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the armed forces, commander in chief of the Russian armed forces, military commander in chief, when he makes a presentation to the president, that presentation has likely been drafted, and a copy sent to presidential administration, reviewed. The president gets pre-briefed on these points. So nothing's going to take him by surprise. So when Putin rolled in to have this meeting with Gerasimov, and Gerasimov gave him the reports about Kyiv being effectively surrounded, 31 battalions of Ukrainian troops being effectively surrounded and now subject to elimination. Putin echoed this and supported this and embraced this. These are big statements that can be made, and frankly speaking, they could be relatively refuted if they weren't true. So I tend to believe the Russians, because over the course of this conflict, the Russians have been far more honest and open than the Ukrainians, who have been, propagandized from the very beginning. The Ukrainians are fighting very hard. There's no doubt about that. But their war goes through an information warfare filter run by the British and the United States. Gdansk is surrounded. The Ukrainians right now are desperately trying to break in and break out, and they're being slaughtered by the Russians. Bryansk is effectively surrounded. The Russians are clearing out the pocket. The Ukrainians, you were forced to do this propaganda exercise where two, I believed, UH-60 aircraft were flown in at very low level, and they disgorged 11 or so special forces operators who were going to clear some villages and clear the way and make it possible for the counterattack to succeed. The insert was monitored by Russian drones, who then documented how they killed every single one of these people. And yet the Western headlines, they show this because this is what the British do. The British planned this operation to be this major imagery-based thing, helicopters penetrating the Russian lines. Russians have no air defense, apparently. These brave special forces guys, oh, geez, Budanov, the leader, he's there at the front directing it. And they show a photograph of him bravely marching forward, directing the troops. It turns out, however, that photograph was taken 100 kilometers away in the city of Pavlod, because people looked at the building notified and noticed certain identifiable features and matched it to the actual place where the photograph it's all fake. I mean, everything's fake except the dead Ukrainians, and that's what's happening here. But the most important thing that most people don't pick up on is that up and down the line, there's at least 50 similar encirclements taking place of a smaller nature, because this is how the battlefield has evolved with the Russians, with the Ukrainians, picking a point where they stand. They say, this is where we fight, and for all the people to move forward inch by inch by inch. You do know that since 2014, Ukrainians have turned that area in Donetsk into the single most fortified PL piece of land on the planet. I mean, they have dug in all this stuff. There's no army in the world without the use of nuclear weapons that could do what the Russians are doing right now. All right, this is ask the Israelis when they go up against Hezbollah's defenses in southern Lebanon. When they get up in the hills and the Hezbollah boys come out and knock them in the nose, that's the fight that's going in. And the Israeli army, the vaunted Israeli army, gets stopped hill number one. All right. The Russians have actually fought through these towns, and the Ukrainians dig into the towns. They put human hostages in the basement, making it possible for the Russians to actually drop the building. So the Russians have to come in and then evacuate the humans and then assault through. Look at the Battle of Mariupol and what really happened there with the AOV bastards that slaughtered civilians. This is what the Russians are doing, and they're winning. But now the Russians are getting to the point where they've achieved dominance across the battlefield. The Ukraine are still there in large numbers fighting, but the Russians get them to commit to a strong point. Then the Russians do a pincer around it. And the Ukrainians have the choice to withdraw to the next fortified position they prepared in the rear. And then the Russians push forward or they hold and they die. This is why the Ukrainians are losing 2,500 to 3,000 men a day. 2,500 to 3,000 men a day. That's real numbers, guys. And we in the West just pretend it's not happening. Or we do what the British told people to do, flip it, take the Ukrainian numbers and say that's what we're doing to the Russians. But it ain't happening, guys. The Russians aren't doing the human wave tactics you think about. Every piece of this, the Ukrainians are just running crude propaganda. I've been to Russia, talked to the leaders. Look, I'm not the world's greatest interrogator. I spent 7 years getting them to tell me the truth. And I know when somebody's lying, I can tell. And I know when people are uncomfortable. I've done it a long time. And when I look the Russians in the eyes, I see honest men speaking back. First of all, their answers are very honest because I get direct answers from people about losses, about the difficulty of the fight, about logistical difficulties. The Russians aren't saying this is easy. Every Russian I've talked to says this is the hardest thing in the world. Those Ukrainian sobs are putting up a hell of a fight, but we're winning. We're beating them. And I believe them. I look at the Ukraine. They're just liars, straight up liars. This is a propaganda exercise, unparalleled, and history will show it to be such. It will show it to be such. It's a tragedy what's going on right now. But, Donald Trump has basically said, we're going to let him fight it out. Europe is going to continue to provide as much financial and material support as possible. And the end result is the Russians will kill every Ukrainian necessary for this war to end. And that is a tragedy because this means that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are going to die because Donald Trump doesn't have the courage to tell Europe to back off and tell the Ukrainians it's over. Putin appears in fatigues and he's briefed by Gasimov and the general staff. And the first thing he says is, our military is united in understanding that our top priority is preserving the lives and health of our servicemen. That's exactly, Ray, what you've been saying. And then he goes on to say, we will fulfill all of our tasks. You're darn straight you will. So when he says we will do all of our tasks, he means every one of them, including the one that we said in February of 2022. He's done all of these. But moreover, he continued, I stress this, meaning about the preservation of the lives and health, because there was a period when the opposite side tried to show that we suffered more. It was simply nonsense in an attempt to fool their own population. They're fooling their own population. Today, the situation is such that our losses, thank God, are many times lower than the losses of the opposite side. Let's hear what Kerry Starmer had to say just 24 hours earlier. It's reported 100,000 killed in Donetsk alone. They're dead. The Russians have lost total 1 million Russian soldiers are dead or wounded. How does that square? By the way, the United States doesn't have access to the data, but some people in the British government may have access to some Ukrainian data, and the Ukrainian data would show that this is just straight up propaganda and that the reality is every single Ukrainian, they're fighting, killing, losing 3 to 5 to 1. If the Russians have lost 10, this equates to, if I get the math right, 50,000 Russians have lost their lives versus 250,000 to 500,000 Ukrainians. And that's more accurate. That's what's going on here, because the kill ratio is what the Russians have claimed, which is supported by the reality on the battlefield. If the Ukrainians were killing Russians at a 5 to 1 rate in their favor, the Russians wouldn't be winning. The fact is that the Russians are winning means that they are inflicting much higher casualty rates. And this propaganda nonsense is meant to fool their own population. And unfortunately, it works because most people aren't paying attention. And I want to bring something else up. Putin's been saying this over and over again, is Russia is not mobilizing. Russia has only signed up soldiers on a volunteer basis. Only people, they're deployed military in the special military operation, sign a contract like we do. They call them contract soldiers. We call them volunteers. But what does everybody who joins the military today do? They sign a contract with the military. It's the same concept. And so they're able to recruit people in a time of war to do the fighting. And how many troops do Russia have deployed in the area? A little under 800,000. So basically, it's a one-to-one operation with the Russians and Ukrainians on the front line. If you study warfare, you know that you need to carry out effective offensive operations 3-to-1. And if you're carrying out offensive operations against a heavily fortified position, 5-to-1, and you're going to lose a lot of guys. Well, the Russians aren't losing a lot of guys comparatively. They're assaulting the most heavily fortified positions known in the world, and they're beating the enemy at a 1-to-1 ratio. So because the kill ratio is 12-to-1, 15-to-1 in some cases, some people would say 36 to 39-to-1. I mean, that's what the dead body exchange rate is. I think that might be a little high, but the bottom line is normally when you're going to lose 3-to-1, meaning 3 Russians to 1 Ukrainian in an assault. Here we have the Russians attacking the most heavily defended space in the world, and their kill ratio is 12-to-1, 15-to-1, 20-to-1. Why? Because they're winning, because they're doing it their way. They're doing it with their algorithm. And this is a war of attrition. The job is to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. And they've done it. Ukrainians are running out of manpower. Russia's not running out of manpower. The Ukrainians have to bring in weapons that NATO no longer has. Russia has actually drained NATO's arsenal, but the Germans just gave the Ukrainians 2 or 3 more Patriot batteries. They'll be dead by the month. Okay. That's how it works, guys. This war is over. First of all, I didn't say 3 weeks. I said about a month. But that turned out to be wrong, because I thought Russia was going to war. Russia's not at war. That's the other thing people don't get. This is a special military operation. If this was war, Russia would mobilize. Oh, and the biggest gift we gave Russia was compelling them to mobilize when they didn't want to, and suddenly finding out that about 60% of their mobilization facilities were run by corrupt individuals who hadn't stocked it properly. And what did the Russians do? They fixed everything. So today, if remember, NATO want to go to war with Russia today. If Russia said, okay, we'll mobilize, they can get 5 million guys up in arms in a month and a half, fully equipped, fully armed, organized into divisions, corps now with operational doctrine that reflects military reality, and they will roll over NATO like a hot knife through butter. You know what will NATO do? They can't. I told you the Germans are too busy, pissing their pants and eating, donuts and schnittli and pretzels. They don't want to fight. The Russians don't want to fight either. But the Russians now is more prepared for war than they have ever been, thanks to what the West has done here. Russia isn't just beating Ukraine. Russia's beating the collective West. Russia's outproducing NATO countries defense industry-wise 4-to-1. Russia's just a gas station with nuclear weapons. That's pretty damn good gas station. They got a hell of a shop, Mart, because they got everything you could want and more. But the other thing I would say for the people, what about the sanctions? What about this, that, and the other thing? If Russia is a gas station, then they're the best damn gas station in the world, because that's what they do. Ask the Saudis every time they tried to have a little energy security crisis with the Russians, and they went up with them. We're going to squeeze them out of the markets. What happened to the Saudis? They surrendered because Russia does this better than Russia produces oil cheaper than anybody else in the world. When we pump oil out of the ground here, the best we can get in Texas, what $36 a barrel cost out of the ground. When oil's at $30 or $60 a barrel, you make $24 profit. Not enough. Russia pulls it out of the ground at $11.12 a barrel. And when oil's at 60, that means they're making a profit of over $40 a barrel. That's more profit than we make. So they don't have to sell as much oil to make as much profit as we do. And now, because of what we've done with the sanctioning, oil prices are going up, which means Russians have to sell fewer barrels to make the same amount of money. The people who encourage sanctioning of Russian energy are the dumbest people in the world. You don't want to take on the biggest gas station in the world when you're driving a Humvee out of gas on a highway in the middle of nowhere. And that's where the West is right now. First of all, we're not restarting nuclear weapons tests, so just stop that nonsense. Trump's tweet shows the ignorance of the man. He directed the Secretary of War to carry out these tests. Sorry, Secretary of War, not your bailiwick. It's not your portfolio. We have other agencies that do that, affiliated with the Department of Energy and overseeing our nuclear weapons. The Secretary of Defense of War has nothing to do with that. We do subcritical tests. We've been doing subcritical tests for some time. So has Russia. So is China. These means that whatever we do, we don't get vision. So it's not a nuclear test. It complies with the test ban treaty, and we're going to continue to comply with the test ban treaty. What happened is that the president was informed that Russia did two nuclear tests, the Burevestnik and the Poseidon, that both were tests of a nuclear propulsion system. The Besnik, as the Russians apparently have done that, which we could not do. It's been taken a long time. 1957, I think, is when the initiating instruction was given to Russian Soviet defense industry to produce a nuclear-powered cruise missile. We started our own pro project around that time. We built a couple. They're dirty as hell. We fly them out and they just spew radiation. We said, my God, we can't do this. And so we stopped the Russians. They actually continued this. They have some very good nuclear research centers in Russia that in the United States, we don't have the equivalent of. Yes, we have Sandia, we have Los Alamos, we have what the hell's the one in California? No, Lawrence Livermore. Yeah, and we got other, but the Russians have the one near Moscow that does mainly commercial work now. But they have another one. I think it was what was that name? Secret City Arzamov or Armov or Razimov or something, 116. What the bottom line is, they converted an old seminary into a nuclear research for their weapons program. And these guys have worked with the civilian guys, and they've produced apparently a clean nuclear reactor, small. And it basically generates heat, and then this heat will superheat air and do what a scramjet does. You superheat air, and then the expansion of the air propels the thing forever because you're not running out of fuel. You got a nuclear engine that's replicating what the fuel is supposed to do, and a turbofan and all this other kind of stuff. The Russians did it. They succeeded and they tested it. That same concept of a nuclear propulsion applies with the Poseidon drone. Drone is unpiloted vehicle. That's what a drone is basically. It's a vehicle with no pilot. So it's going off either based upon pre-med or receiving communications from outside sources. These were the nuclear tests that the Russians did, and the president, because he's literally dumber than dirt, was told the Russians have done nuclear tests. So he said, well, we got to do our own nuclear test. And so what we're getting right now is a Minuteman being put into the test silo, I believe, at Vandenberg, and we're going to do a launch so we can say we tested our nuclear. Well, hell, we just did another test of the Trident D5s. The president's too stupid to realize we've been doing nuclear tests forever. We just did life extension tests on the D5s, popped off a number of them. So it's not like we've done, but now he has to declare it because he feels intimidated by the fact that Putin has now declared these two. What's the significance of this? Look, Ray was kind enough to publish something the other day about a conversation that Vladimir Putin had with journalists, Western journalists in 2016, where he basically said, you guys are too stupid to live. Do you not understand what's happening when you got rid of the ABM treaty? Which again, Ray dating himself, I'll do it for him, 1972. Ray was there in Moscow when it was signed. That's something foundational treaty because it recognized the fact that nuclear wars can never be won. Therefore, they should never be fought. Therefore, we shouldn't even bother trying to build defenses against nuclear weapons because it's just stupid. People will build better offensive weapons. And yet the United States withdrew from the ABM treaty. And then we began to deploy systems, the GBI system in Greeley Air Force Base and Ground Base Intercept in Glay Air Force Base. Interesting movie just came out on Netflix. Can't remember the name of it right now. But it doesn't work and it won't work. Every one of those missiles is handmade because the one before it had a problem. So they had to fix it. They're not in serial production. And then we started taking Aegis ashore. The Mark 41 system used to launch missiles, either Tomahawk missiles or SM-3, SM-6 anti-ballistic missiles or anti-air missiles. We put them ashore, one in Poland, one in Romania, and the Russians went, that's a little close to home. Then we started deploying Aegis ships around the Russian periphery designed to shoot down missiles. And we put in this missile defense thing. And the Russians went, that's not good, because even if it probably won't work, but if it does, it creates the perception that the United States could launch a preemptive strike against Russia, attempting to kill as many Russian missiles as possible and leaving the Russians to say, if we launch or the United States is going to shoot down most of them, we won't get the damage we want. Then we get a second and third strike from the United States that'll wipe us out. So the idea is to dominate the nuclear deterrence profile so that the Russians are in an inferior position and therefore not likely to start a fight. And Putin said, but that's not how we operate. So in 2016 said, we're going to start things. I can't tell you about them right now, but we're starting things. In 2018, he unveiled them, the Sarmat missile, heavily ICBM, which travels around the South Pole, not the North Pole. We have no early warning defense capability at all. Comes in, they could hit us. We'll never even know what happened. The avant-garde maneuvering hypersonic missile, it actually works, unlike anything we produce, which doesn't work. The avant-garde works. Gosh, he did. He talked about the Perezik, nuclear power cruise missile. People poo-pooed it because right after he advertised it, they had an accident in the north. 5 nuclear scientists died. That's, by the way, how we know so much about the propulsion system, because the Russians, in surprising fashion, actually identified who these scientists were and what part of the Defense Atomic Agencies they worked for. And anybody with a brain on their shoulders reads their bios and reads their PhD dissertations and understands the research they're involved in. You go, oh, you just explained a lot about what's going on with Beer, Berenik, and then of course Poseidon. The same thing. He declared it's there. That was 200 what? 18. Here we are today. Sarmat's deployed, Avangard's deployed, Brevesnik and the Poseidon are now being deployed. That means the Russians have developed an arsenal of weapons that the United States has nothing to counter. Nothing. If Russia wanted to launch a first strike right now, they could kill hundreds of millions of Americans, and we couldn't do anything. We can't. That's the reality. Anybody who believes in the tooth fairy believes that our missile defenses work. They don't. We don't have the missiles to shoot down what the Russians are sending. We've got nothing. So the Russians are in an ultimate position of power. And people say that sounds scary to me. It should, because it was deliberately made this way by George W. Bush's decision to walk away from the ABM treaty, by all these decisions to move NATO east, by all these decisions to build up military forces on the eastern flank of NATO. All this led to the Russians saying, we have to take countermeasures. Now they have the countermeasures, and they have countermeasures that are superior to anything we have, and we have countermeasures. The only thing we have is the threat of unleashing hell on the Russians if they try to use it. But the reality is, if the Russians ever came to a point where they felt they needed to use these weapons to save themselves, they wouldn't hesitate, and we would all be dead in a couple hours. So people should be frightened by what's happening right now, because Trump is doing everything humanly possible to move the world closer to that point where the Russians feel compelled to take action, and we don't have the weapons to counter it. We don't. That's the reality. Anybody who tells you anything other than that is lying, straight out lying. The Russians have weapons we can't counter, period. End of story. There is no counter. There is no defense. There is nothing. And when the Russians demonstrated those weapons by both the Brevesnik and Poseidon tests, they were sending a message to the United States. It says, you want to play chicken, you want to play a game of nuclear brinkmanship, you're going to lose, because we have weapons you can't counter. And if you push us to a point where we feel our survival is threatened, we're going to use them, and you will lose. America will cease to exist. That's the message that Putin sent. And Trump, because he's too dumb to understand it, doubled down on stupidity. That's what's happening right now. Look, Europe is a bunch of caged chihuahua. They are incapable of doing anything. They're not even cute. It's an insult to Chihuahua. I mean, it's these are useless people, useless human beings. Um, I got to be careful what I say here because I don't like this guy. He doesn't know that of which he speaks. I mean, it'd be one thing if this guy was a military hero. This guy could do 5 push-ups. This guy could do anything. Look at his background, look at his resume, look who he is, and you'll know what I'm talking about. This is a guy that after he made this statement because of the press blowback had a nervous breakdown. He can't even flatten his own newspaper. These are people who are programmed to say the dumbest things at the dumbest time. This is like Tajikalis out there, our Russia. Russia needs to be broken up into tiny little states. That's the only way we're going to have peace. I mean, a little Baltic woman thinking she can break Russia. It's like Mark Rutte, a failed Dutch prime minister, suddenly, growing a pair. No, these people don't know these aren't the real deal. This isn't somebody who's been there, done that, got the t-shirt, understands the consequences of their words. These are fakes. These are fronts. These are, superficiality personified, coming up there saying things on cue because they're living off of a script actually written by the British. If you want to know, this is a script designed to keep Ukraine in the fight, keep the European Union relevant, keep NATO funded. In order to do this, you have to say the dumbest things because otherwise, if the truth comes out, come on, Belgium. They can't even make a waffle anymore. We make waffles better than they do, So these aren't serious people, and yet their words are paired on the media as if they're serious words. Belgium can do nothing. They can flatten nothing. They have no capability. NATO can do nothing. They can flatten nothing. NATO is only relevant with the United States, and the United States doesn't want to do anything. I want to remind you, while he's speaking about flattening Russia, the United States made the decision to withdraw from the Romanian theater of operations, where we have, the 101st Airborne Maintaining Brigade. We just sent elements of the 3rd Infantry Division in there. We're going to drop that number. It was 1,600. We're going to take it down to under 1,000. We're starting the process of withdrawing from Europe, not reinforcing Europe. So while Europe is speaking about building up this imaginary army, they'll never be able to fund or equip or do anything with. And who's going to fight in Germany? If Germany was invaded, this is according to a German poll invaded. If Germany was invaded, only 16% of German men said we'd fight for Germany. That means Germany has no men, because if you're not willing to fight for your country, you ain't a man, especially if your country's been invaded. And yet the Germans are like, no, we don't. We don't want to die for our country. Now, talking about if somebody invades Germany, now what happens if Germany starts going off invading other countries? You think the Germans are suddenly going to change? Oh, wait, if we're invading another country, I'm ready to go to war. Germany, who wants to build the biggest military in Europe to become the European powerhouse, can't even motivate enough fake men to sign up to defend their own country. And they're the strongest nation in Europe. Europe is a freaking joke when it comes to the military. They got nothing. And they're only there because America is backing them up. But we're not going to back them up forever. We're getting the hell out of Europe because we don't want any of this. Trump just washed his hands of the war. I don't know if people listen to what he said. Sometimes you got to let them fight it out. That means we're done. Are you, Tom? Probably not. No, you're not. You know the consequences. Putin putting you on notice what the consequences are. We're out of here. The Ukrainians are going to get slaughtered, and this propaganda exercise that's propping everything up, making people think that Ukraine's in the fight is, suddenly when they're all dead, you realize how stupid people were to believe any of this. And when you consider that Gerasimov, the chief of staff and military commander-in-chief of Russia's armed forces, presents briefings to the president, those presentations have typically been prepared and sent to the presidential administration for review. The president receives advanced briefings on these matters. Nothing catches him off guard. So when Putin met with Gerasimov and received reports about Kyiv being surrounded, Pov being surrounded, 31 Ukrainian battalions being surrounded and facing elimination, Putin confirmed and endorsed these statements. These are significant claims that could easily be challenged if they were false. I'm inclined to trust the Russians because throughout this conflict, they've demonstrated far greater honesty and transparency than the Ukrainians, who've been heavily propagandized from the start. The Ukrainians are fighting fiercely. That's undeniable.